The wind rolled across the tarmac like a warning, carrying the scent of snow and jet fuel through the chain-link fence surrounding Whitmore Air Base. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb adjusted his collar against the cold as he watched the white supply van pull up to the south gate. Nothing unusual about that. Contractors came and went daily, hauling everything from MREs to computer parts. What made him look twice was the woman who stepped out. She moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made seasoned soldiers take notice. No badge dangled from her neck, no clipboard clutched in her hands. Just a worn black duffel bag slung over one shoulder and boots that had seen more miles than most military-issue gear. Her jacket was zipped halfway, sleeves pushed to her elbows despite the December chill. "Ma'am, I need to see your base credentials or work order," called out Corporal Danny Rodriguez from the guard booth. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. The woman may be mid-30s. Marcus guessed didn't answer immediately. Her eyes swept across the airfield with the systematic precision of someone conducting a security assessment. She paused. On the aircraft hangars, the control tower, even the fuel depot in the distance. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. "I'm here for access check and asset retrieval." Rodriguez frowned and stepped closer. "Ma'am, there's no access log under that category for today. You're going to need to—" "Let me guess," interrupted Sergeant Mike Patterson, emerging from the guard shack while pulling on his gloves. "Another contractor who thinks showing up is the same as having clearance?" His tone wasn't hostile, just weary from dealing with bureaucratic mix-ups. The woman's expression remained unchanged. She adjusted her duffel strap and waited, as if she had all the time in the world. There was something unsettling about her stillness, not the fidgeting anxiety of someone caught without proper paperwork, but the calm patience of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. Marcus felt an itch between his shoulder blades, the kind that came from years of tours in places where standing still too long could get you killed. Something about this whole situation felt off, though he couldn't put his finger on what. "Rodriguez, call for the watch supervisor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to trust his instincts. "We need to sort this out properly." As Rodriguez reached for his radio, Marcus studied the woman more carefully. Her duffel had an odd wear pattern creased at the corners, like it had been packed and unpacked countless times under harsh conditions. One shoulder strap had been reinforced with black tape, the kind of field repair you made when replacement wasn't an option. Her hands were steady, ungloved despite the cold. Clean nails, but old scarring along the back of her right wrist. Not from an accident, the pattern was too specific. Rope burn, maybe, or something similar. Within minutes, Lieutenant Jake Morrison jogged over from the administrative building, tablet in hand. Fresh out of officer training, Morrison had been pulling watch supervisor duty for only 3 weeks. He still wore his authority like a new uniform, crisp and formal, but not quite broken in. "What's the situation?" Morrison asked, slightly out of breath. Civilians showed up with no credentials. Patterson explained. "Says she's here for some kind of asset retrieval, but there's nothing in the manifest." Morrison looked at the woman expectantly. "Ma'am, what's your name?" Silence. "You understand this is a restricted military installation. Without proper identification, I'm required to detain you until we can verify your purpose here." The woman nodded once, a slight dip of her chin that somehow managed to convey both understanding and complete lack of concern. Morrison hesitated. In training, they'd covered dozens of scenarios: hostile infiltrators, confused civilians, even the occasional protester. But they'd never talked about what to do with someone who seemed perfectly willing to be detained without offering any explanation whatsoever. "Rodriguez, Patterson escort her to interim holding. Standard procedure. They didn't cuff her." She didn't resist. But as they walked past the fuel truck near the secondary hangar, Marcus noticed her eyes flick toward the vehicle's identification tag, then to the gauge readings visible through the driver's window. Quick, professional observations that lasted barely a second each. The administrative building's interior was painted institutional white, though years of use had faded it to pale ivory. Scuff marks near the baseboards and the perpetual smell of burnt coffee gave it the lived-in feel of a place where people worked long hours under fluorescent lights. The interim holding room was sparse, a steel bench bolted to the wall, a single overhead bulb that cast harsh shadows, and a heating unit that clicked on and off with mechanical regularity. The woman sat without being asked, her posture relaxed, but alert. As Patterson inventoried the contents of her duffel, Marcus found himself studying her face. She watched them work with the same calm attention she'd shown at the gate, as if she were memorizing details for a report she'd write later. Inside the bag, a folded jacket, a sealed cable pouch, and a metal case with no external markings. The case was fingerprint-locked civilian electronics equipment, but higher end than most contractors carried. "You want to tell us anything about this?" Morrison asked, gesturing to the case. The woman looked at him steadily, then returned her gaze to the far wall. An hour passed, then another. Morrison checked the base access manifest 3 times, searched contractor databases, even called the main security office. Nothing. No record of her anywhere in the system. Outside, the wind picked up. The weather station in Commander Harrison's office began showing the telltale signs of an incoming storm front, the kind that could shut down air operations for days. Communications would start getting spotty soon. Static creeping into radio channels as the atmospheric pressure shifted. But in the holding room, the woman sat in perfect stillness, hands folded over her knees, boots planted evenly on the concrete floor. She wasn't checking a watch, wasn't tapping her fingers, wasn't showing any of the usual signs of impatience or anxiety. She was waiting. And somehow, Marcus got the feeling she knew exactly what she was waiting for. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the first snowflakes began to drift past the narrow window, he couldn't shake the sense that they were all actors in a play whose script only she had read. The feeling made him want to check the perimeter sensors, verify the security protocols, maybe even call in additional personnel. Instead, he stayed at his post and watched the stranger who had walked into their carefully ordered world with nothing but a duffel bag and the quiet confidence of someone who knew secrets they hadn't even thought to ask about. The snow was falling, harder now, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus could swear he heard the sound of rotors cutting through the wind. Commander Robert Harrison had been running Whitmore Air Base for 4 years, and in that time, he'd learned to recognize the smell of trouble. It usually came wrapped in official paperwork and delivered by junior officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Today, it came in the form of Lieutenant Morrison standing in his office doorway, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a man walking on thin ice. "Sir, we have a situation with the detained civilian." Harrison didn't look up from the incident report he was reviewing. 3 equipment malfunctions in the past week, all involving communications gear. The timing bothered him. Scattered failures often meant systematic problems, and systematic problems usually meant someone was either incompetent or deliberately causing trouble. "Let me guess," Harrison said, still reading. "She's demanding a lawyer, threatening to call her congressman, or claiming she's somebody important we should recognize." "No, sir. She hasn't said anything at all." Now Harrison looked up. Morrison was young, green, but he wasn't stupid. The kid understood the difference between normal problems and the kind that kept commanders awake at night. "Define anything at all. She won't give her name, won't explain why she's here, won't even acknowledge direct questions. She just ... sits there, like she's waiting for something." Harrison set down his pen. In his experience, There were three types of people who showed up at military installations without proper credentials: confused civilians who'd made an honest mistake, protesters looking to make a statement, and professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. The first two groups always talked explaining, arguing, demanding. The third group only spoke when they had something to say. How long has she been in holding? 3 hours, sir. Any identification in her personal effects? Just electronics equipment. High-end stuff, but nothing we can access without proper authorization. Harrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the main compound. The snow was coming down steadily now, coating the tarmac and blurring the edges of the buildings. Weather like this made everyone nervous. Limited visibility, potential communication disruptions, and the constant possibility of being cut off from outside support. Have you run her description through facial recognition? First thing we tried, sir. Nothing in the databases. Which meant either she'd never been photographed by law enforcement or intelligence services, or someone had scrubbed her records clean. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. I want to talk to her myself. The walk to the holding area gave Harrison time to think. Whitmore wasn't a high-profile installation. They handled logistics and transport for the northern sector. Important work, but not the kind that attracted attention from foreign intelligence services. Still, the base processed sensitive cargo and maintained communication links with classified operations. Someone with the right knowledge could cause significant damage if they wanted to. The woman looked exactly as Morrison had described: calm, alert, and completely uninterested in explaining herself. She sat with her hands folded, watching the door with the patient attention of someone accustomed to waiting. When Harrison entered, she didn't stand, didn't speak, didn't even shift position. "I'm Commander Harrison," he said, taking the chair across from her. "This is my base, and you're currently my problem. I'm hoping we can resolve this situation." Quickly and quietly, she looked at him with steady gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance. Harrison had been stared at by hostile prisoners, angry politicians, and review boards looking for someone to blame. This was different. She wasn't trying to intimidate or impress him. She was simply observing, as if his reaction was information she needed to collect. "Let's start simple," Harrison continued. "Do you have any identification?" Silence. "Are you here on official business?" "Nothing." "Do you represent any government agency or private organization?" The woman's expression didn't change, but Harrison caught something in her eyes. Not amusement, exactly, but the kind of recognition that passed between professionals who understood the game being played. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "in my experience, people who refuse to talk fall into two categories: those who are hiding something and those who are protecting something. Which one are you?" For the first time, she spoke. "Does it matter?" Her voice was quiet but clear, with no trace of accent or regional dialect. She sounded like someone who'd spent years training herself to be unremarkable, forgettable. The kind of voice that wouldn't stand out in a crowd or stick in someone's memory after a brief conversation. "It matters to me," Harrison replied. "This is a secure facility. I can't allow unidentified personnel to remain on base indefinitely." "I understand. Then help me understand. Why are you here?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze shifting to the small window near the ceiling. Snow was still falling, and the light was beginning to fade as afternoon edged toward evening. "Your communications have been compromised," she said finally. Harrison felt his stomach tighten. "Explain." "The weather monitoring system in your office has been receiving false data for the past 12 hours. The lag time you've been experiencing isn't caused by atmospheric interference. It's being introduced upstream to mask signal intrusion." Harrison's mind raced. The weather station had been glitching all day. but the diagnostics kept coming back clean. According to the technicians, everything was functioning normally. How would you know that? Because I know what to look for. And what exactly are you looking for? The woman stood, moving with fluid economy. There's a vehicle parked behind. The old supply trailer near the perimeter. I'd start there. Harrison felt the conversation slipping away from him. You're not going anywhere until you explain how you know about our internal systems. Commander, she said, and for the first time there was something almost like sympathy in her voice. You can hold me here as long as you want, but the signal. Breach is active right now, and every minute you waste questioning me is another minute of compromised data leaving your base. The heating unit clicked off, leaving the room suddenly quiet except for the soft whisper of snow against the window. Harrison stared at the woman, weighing options he didn't fully understand. His instincts were telling him two contradictory things: that she was dangerous and that she was here to help. Morrison, he called toward the door. Get Webb and Rodriguez. We're going to take a look at that vehicle. As they prepared to leave, the woman spoke once more. Commander? When? Was the last time your vehicle log sensors were calibrated? Harrison paused. 2 weeks ago. Why? She nodded, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. You might want to check them again. Outside, the wind had shifted, and Harrison could hear something in the distance, a low rumble that was growing steadily louder. He looked. Up at the darkening sky, squinting through the falling snow. An aircraft was approaching from the south, flying low and fast. But it wasn't one of theirs, and it wasn't following standard approach patterns. As it grew closer, Harrison could make out the sleek profile of a command helicopter, the kind reserved for high-level personnel who didn't announce their visits in advance. His radio crackled to life. Base Command, this is Falcon 1 requesting. Immediate landing clearance. Priority, Alpha authorization. Harrison reached for his radio, but stopped when he saw the woman's face. For the first time since her arrival, she looked almost relieved. They're here, she said quietly. Who's here? She didn't answer. She was already walking toward the door, moving with the purposeful stride of someone whose waiting was finally over. The helicopter touched down with military precision, its rotors whipping snow and debris into a stinging cloud that forced everyone on the tarmac to shield their eyes. Harrison stood behind the operations building, his jaw clenched tight, as he watched a figure emerge from the aircraft before the blades had even finished their wind down. General Patricia Caldwell stepped onto the tarmac with the kind of authority that made decades of military protocol snap into place around her. No wasted motion, no unnecessary ceremony. Just the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to having. Her orders followed without question. She wore field fatigues instead of dress uniform, and her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun that suggested she'd been traveling for hours. Harrison felt his stomach drop. 3-star generals didn't make unannounced visits to logistics bases unless something had gone very, very wrong. General Caldwell, he said, stepping forward with what he hoped was appropriate respect mixed with professional composure. We weren't expecting. Where is she? Caldwell interrupted, her voice carrying easily over the dying whine of the helicopter's turbines. Ma'am, the woman you're holding, where is she? Harrison's mind raced. How did Caldwell know about their detainee? They hadn't reported the incident up the chain of command, yet standard procedure was to handle civilian issues at the base level, unless they posed a clear security threat. She's an interim holding general. We were just investigating some irregularities in. She's not irregular, Commander. She's pre-cleared for operational priority. I need her gear returned and her case unlocked immediately. The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. Pre-cleared meant the woman had been authorized for access at levels he couldn't even see. It meant she'd been operating under classified protocols while he'd been treating her like a potential security threat. Sir, She arrived with no identification. No paperwork, no. She doesn't need paperwork, Caldwell said, her tone suggesting the conversation was over. She built half the detection protocols for this exact type of intrusion. Now, where's her equipment? Harrison led the way to the administrative building, his mind spinning with implications he didn't want to consider. Behind them, base personnel, scattered to their duties with the heightened efficiency that always followed high-level visits. Everyone could sense the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. In the holding room, the woman, whoever she really was, stood. As they entered, she didn't salute, didn't acknowledge Caldwell's rank, just gave a slight nod that somehow conveyed both respect and familiarity. "You waited longer than intended," Caldwell said. "That's on us." "Wasn't a problem," the woman replied, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence Harrison had noticed earlier. Caldwell turned to Morrison, who was hovering near the door, looking like he wanted to disappear. "Return her gear. Full access, no restrictions. And I want her case contents secured. For operational use." "Yes, ma'am," Morrison stammered, practically running from the room. Harrison watched the exchange with growing unease. "General, I need to understand what's happening here." "If there's a security breach, there is," Caldwell said. "Multiple systems compromised, data being extracted in real time, and a coordinated effort to mask the intrusion using your own monitoring equipment." She paused, fixing Harrison with a stare that had probably withered better men than him. "How long did you think you could keep running diagnostics on corrupted systems and expect to find the problem?" The question hit home. Harrison had been relying on automated systems to verify the integrity of those same systems, a logical fallacy that should have been obvious in hindsight. "We followed standard protocols. Standard protocols assume the people running them aren't being actively deceived," the woman interjected. She was opening her case now, revealing an array of detection equipment that looked civilian but felt military. "Your weather monitoring system has been feeding you fabricated data to cover signal extraction. The lag time you've been experiencing is intentional. Someone's buying themselves processing time while you trust your instruments." Harrison felt heat rise in his cheeks. "How long have you known about this?" "Since I arrived. The signature was obvious once I saw your perimeter setup." "Then why didn't you just say so?" The woman looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. "Would you have believed me? An unidentified civilian shows up with no credentials and tells you your entire security system is compromised? You would have assumed I was either lying or trying to gather intelligence myself." She was right, and Harrison hated that she was right. Military thinking was built on verification and procedure, not on trusting strangers who made extraordinary claims. But that same thinking had blinded him to a threat that was apparently sophisticated enough to fool their detection systems. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Time and access," she said, connecting a small device to her tablet. "The intrusion is active, which means we can trace it back to its source. But we need to move quickly. They'll know their cover is blown as soon as we start disrupting their signal." Caldwell stepped forward. "Commander, I'm placing her in operational command of this investigation. Your personnel will provide full support and cooperation." The words felt like a slap, but Harrison nodded. "Understood, General." "Good, because if this breach extends beyond your base, we're looking at a national security incident that will have congressional oversight and media attention. I don't think any of us want that kind of scrutiny." Harrison definitely didn't want that kind of scrutiny. He'd seen what happened to base commanders who found themselves in the middle of security failures, congressional hearings, career-ending investigations, and the kind of public humiliation that followed you into civilian life. "What do you need?" he asked the woman. She was already moving, gathering her equipment with practiced efficiency. I need your best technical analyst and someone who knows your facility layout. We're going to track this signal to its source and shut it down before they can complete their data extraction. Webb, Harrison called. You're on point with our guest here. Full access, no questions. Staff Sergeant Webb nodded, though Harrison could see the confusion in his eyes. None of them had training for this kind of situation. Electronic warfare was supposed to be handled by specialists at higher command levels, not by logistics personnel at remote bases. As they prepared to leave, the woman paused and looked directly. And Harrison, Commander, I want you to understand something. This isn't about your procedures or your personnel. Whoever is doing this plan specifically for bases like yours, places where security is good enough to trust, but not sophisticated enough to detect advanced intrusion techniques. They're counting on you to follow standard protocols while they work around them. How do I prevent this from happening again? You listen to the people who notice things that don't fit the pattern, she said, even when they show up without badges. Harrison watched her walk away, flanked by Webb and the young lieutenant who'd volunteered to help. General Caldwell remained behind, her expression unreadable. Sir, may I ask who she is? Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow fall through the window. Someone who's very good at her job, she said finally, and someone who's saved more lives than you'll ever know. Is my base secure? It will be, Caldwell said, assuming she can do what she does best. Outside, Harrison could see the small team moving across the compound toward the communications building. They moved with purpose now, no longer the confused group trying to figure out why a stranger had appeared at their gate. The woman, he still didn't know her name, had transformed from a security problem into a solution he hadn't known he needed. But as he watched them disappear into the building, Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. People didn't deploy 3-star generals and mysterious specialists for simple security breaches. Whatever was happening here was bigger than his base, bigger than his understanding, and probably bigger than he wanted to know. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the steady hum of electronic equipment working to uncover secrets that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. Technical analyst Rebecca Foster had been staring at the same screen for 3 hours, trying to understand why the base's communication logs looked perfect when everything else felt wrong. The timestamps aligned, the data stream showed normal patterns, and every diagnostic returned green across the board. But perfection in electronic systems was like silence in a jungle, usually a sign that something was very wrong. When Staff Sergeant Webb appeared at her workstation with a woman she'd never seen before, Rebecca's first instinct was to close the classification screens she'd been reviewing. Then she noticed Webb's expression tense, focused, and carrying the weight of orders he couldn't fully explain. Foster, this is our specialist, Webb said, his voice carefully neutral. She needs access to the communication logs and perimeter monitoring data. Rebecca looked at the woman mid-30s, unremarkable civilian clothes, equipment case that looked expensive but unmarked. No badge, no identification visible, but something in her posture suggested she was accustomed to being in secure facilities. I'll need to see authorization. You have it, the woman said quietly, handing over a tablet displaying clearance codes Rebecca had never seen before. They were genuine. She could tell from the encryption patterns, but they also carried access levels that made her stomach tighten. Whoever this person was, she had the authority to see everything. What exactly are you looking for? Rebecca asked, stepping aside to let the woman access her workstation. Evidence of signal manipulation. Your logs show consistent timing, no anomalies, perfect data integrity. That's the problem, Rebecca frowned. How is clean data a problem? The woman's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up diagnostic screens Rebecca hadn't known existed. because real-world signals are never perfect. There's always some variation: atmospheric interference, hardware fluctuations, processing delays. When everything looks exactly right, it usually means someone's working very hard to make it look that way. Within minutes, she'd identified 3 separate data streams that showed identical timing patterns, something that should have been statistically impossible. The weather monitoring, vehicle tracking, and perimeter sensor networks were all reporting with precisely synchronized intervals, as if they were being controlled by the same source. "There," the woman said, highlighting a series of timestamp clusters. "Your systems are being fed processed data. Someone's intercepting your signals, filtering them, and sending back modified versions that pass your security checks while hiding their own activity." Rebecca stared at the screen, feeling pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly snap into place. "The lag we've been experiencing. Processing time. They need a few seconds to clean the data before sending it back to you. The lag is consistent because they're running it through automated systems." Webb leaned over Rebecca's shoulder, studying the display. "How long has this been going on?" The woman pulled up historical logs, her search terms revealing a deep understanding of military communication protocols. "At least 72 hours. Possibly longer, but they've been careful not to leave obvious traces." "What are they after?" "Information. Operational schedules, personnel movements, cargo manifests. Everything that moves through this base gets logged, and those logs tell a story about activities across the entire northern sector." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. Whitmore wasn't just a logistics hub, it was a coordination point for operations spanning half the continental United States. Someone with access to their data could predict military movements, identify vulnerable targets, and potentially compromise ongoing missions. "We need to trace the source," the woman continued, opening her equipment case and removing what looked like a modified signal analyzer. "They're using a local relay to mask the extraction point. If we can locate it, we can not only stop the breach, but potentially identify who's behind it." She connected her device to the base's monitoring network, bypassing several security protocols, with authorization codes that clearly carried more weight than standard clearance levels. Within seconds, the analyzer was displaying signal patterns that looked like nothing Rebecca had ever seen. "That's not possible," Rebecca muttered, staring at the readings. "Those frequencies aren't authorized for civilian use." "They're not civilian," the woman replied grimly. "This is military-grade equipment being used to compromise military systems. Someone with significant resources and sophisticated technical knowledge is running this operation." Webb's radio crackled. "All units, be advised. We have movement near the perimeter fence. Vehicle spotted in the northeast quadrant." The woman was already moving, gathering her equipment with fluid efficiency. "That's our relay point. They're probably conducting a scheduled data dump." "How do you know that?" "Because that's what I would do. Maximum extraction during shift changes when monitoring is lightest." She paused, fixing Rebecca with an intense stare. "I need you to maintain this connection and monitor for any changes in the signal pattern. If they detect interference, they'll try to purge their systems and eliminate evidence." Rebecca nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly as she took control of the monitoring station. This was far beyond anything she'd trained for. Electronic warfare wasn't supposed to happen at logistics bases like Whitmore. As the team prepared to leave, the woman turned back to her. "Foster, you've been looking at this data for weeks. What made you suspicious?" "The timing was too perfect," Rebecca admitted. "Real systems have flaws, inconsistencies. This looked like textbook examples from training manuals." The woman almost smiled. "Good instincts. Trust them." Rebecca watched through the window as the small team crossed the compound toward the perimeter road. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility and making movement more difficult. Perfect conditions for someone trying to operate undetected. Her screens began showing new activity signal spikes that appeared and disappeared too quickly for standard monitoring to catch. But the woman's equipment was designed for exactly this kind of detection, and Rebecca could see patterns emerging that told a story of coordinated electronic assault. Someone had been systematically compromising their systems while making it look like everything was functioning normally. The level of sophistication required suggested either foreign intelligence services or domestic actors with access to classified technology. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. A radio crackled with Webb's voice. "We have visual on the target vehicle. NGO markings, but the antenna configuration doesn't match civilian specifications." Rebecca's stomach tightened. NGO vehicles were common around military bases, humanitarian organizations often coordinated with logistics operations for disaster relief and international aid. But using that cover for intelligence gathering was a serious escalation that suggested this wasn't just about stealing information. It was about something much larger. The signal patterns on her screen shifted suddenly, becoming more erratic. Someone was trying to establish an uplink, probably to transmit whatever data they'd collected before the operation was compromised. "They're trying to dump everything," she said into her radio. "You need to stop that transmission." Through the static, she heard the woman's voice. "Already on it." Rebecca watched her screens as the hostile signals began to collapse one by one, cut off by interference that was being precisely applied to disrupt their operations without damaging the base's own systems. It was like watching a master craftsman work, every action calculated, every intervention surgical in its precision. Within minutes, the electronic assault that had been running for days was reduced to scattered noise. But Rebecca knew this was just the beginning. Someone had invested significant resources in compromising Whitmore, and they wouldn't give up easily. Her screens showed one final signal spike, a burst transmission that lasted barely 3 seconds before being cut off. Too short to carry much data, but long enough to send a message. The message was simple. They'd been discovered, but they'd also gotten what they came for. The NGO van sat exactly where the surveillance photos had indicated, parked behind the old supply trailer at the edge of the compound, positioned to have clear line of sight to the communications array while remaining hidden from casual observation. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another relief organization vehicle waiting for clearance to deliver humanitarian supplies. Staff Sergeant Webb crouched behind a maintenance shed, studying the vehicle through binoculars while snow continued to fall around them. The woman, he still didn't know her name, knelt beside him with her signal analyzer, its screen showing electromagnetic signatures that painted a very different picture than the van's innocent exterior. "Active transmission in progress," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Multiple frequency bands, encrypted data streams, and enough power output to reach significant distances." Lieutenant Morrison flanked them from the left, his nervousness evident in the way he kept checking his weapon despite having no intention of using it. This was supposed to be a surveillance operation, not a combat mission, but everyone could feel the tension that came with knowing they were dealing with professionals who'd successfully fooled military security for days. "How many people inside?" Webb asked. The woman adjusted her equipment, scanning for heat signatures and movement patterns. 2, maybe 3. Driver and at least 1 operator running the communication suite. "They've been broadcasting for the past 6 minutes. Webb's radio crackled softly. "Perimeter team in position. We have the vehicle surrounded, but they don't know it yet." The plan was simple. Wait for the transmission to end, then approach the vehicle during the vulnerable window when they were disconnecting equipment. Most intelligence operations included escape protocols that assumed eventual discovery. But Those protocols usually involved more time than a surprise interdiction would allow. Through his binoculars, Webb could see movement inside the van. Shadows shifting against the tinted windows, the occasional glow of electronic displays, and the steady rotation of the antenna array on the roof. Professional setup, but not military. Standard. This was intelligence work being conducted by people who understood technology but weren't necessarily trained soldiers. Signals ending, the woman reported. They're shutting down the transmission and preparing to disconnect. Webb keyed his radio. All units, prepare to move on my mark. Remember, we want them alive, and we want their equipment intact. The van's rear doors opened, and a figure emerged carrying a small equipment case. Average height, civilian clothes, moving with the careful efficiency of someone following a rehearsed procedure. A second person remained inside, probably securing the main communication array. Now, Webb whispered. The perimeter team moved with practiced coordination, emerging from concealment at multiple points to surround the vehicle before the occupants could react. The man with the equipment case froze, his head swiveling as he realized escape routes were being cut off. The van's engine started, but there was nowhere to go. Webb and his team approached from the rear, weapons ready but not aimed. This was about containment, not confrontation. Federal agents, Webb called out, using the cover story they'd agreed on. Step away from the vehicle with your hands visible. The man with the case looked like he was considering whether to run, but basic math told him it was hopeless. 6 armed personnel in coordinated positions against 2 people with no visible weapons and no practical escape route. He sat down the case and raised his hands. Driver, shut off the engine and exit the vehicle, Webb continued. The van's engine died, and after a long moment, the driver's door opened. A woman emerged mid-30s, dark hair, wearing the kind of practical outdoor gear that wouldn't look out of place on a humanitarian worker. She moved slowly, keeping her hands visible, but her eyes were constantly scanning for opportunities. Webb approached the equipment case while Morrison covered the 2 suspects. Inside, he found exactly what they'd expected: sophisticated communication gear, recording devices, and data storage equipment that looked civilian but functioned at military levels. The woman specialist, he really needed to learn her name, was examining the van's interior with systematic thoroughness. Full intelligence gathering suite, she reported. Signal intercept, data processing, encrypted transmission capability. This isn't opportunistic surveillance. This is a coordinated intelligence operation. Who are you working for? Webb asked the suspects. Neither answered. They stood quietly, hands raised, with the patient resignation of people who'd been trained for this possibility. Professional spies didn't break under initial questioning, especially when they knew rescue or legal intervention might still be possible. Webb's radio crackled. Base command to field team. We need that vehicle and equipment secured immediately. Federal transport is inbound for prisoner transfer. The efficiency of the response told Webb this operation was bigger than a simple security breach. Federal agencies didn't dispatch transport aircraft for routine civilian infractions. Someone had been planning for this contingency, which meant the woman specialist hadn't just stumbled onto a security problem. She'd walked into an active counterintelligence operation. Load everything, she said, overseeing the removal of equipment from the van. Document serial numbers, connection ports, antenna configurations. This equipment will tell us exactly who we're dealing with and how long they've been planning this operation. As the team secured the evidence, Webb noticed something that made his blood run cold. The van's registration documents listed it as belonging to International Relief Coordination, a legitimate humanitarian organization that had been working with military logistics for over a decade. If these were foreign operatives using stolen credentials, It meant the breach went far deeper than anyone had realized. "Ma'am," he said quietly to the specialist, "this vehicle is registered to an organization we've been working with for years. They have clearance for humanitarian deliveries across multiple bases." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him with sharp focus. "How many bases?" "Dozens. Maybe more. IRC coordinates relief supplies throughout the Northern Command." Structure. The implications hit both of them simultaneously. If hostile intelligence had compromised IRC's credentials, they hadn't just infiltrated Whitmore. They'd potentially gained access to operational data from half the military installations in the region. Supply schedules, personnel movements, cargo manifests, all of it flowing through coordination channels that everyone trusted implicitly. "We need to contact General Caldwell immediately," the specialist said. "This isn't just about our base anymore." Webb keyed his radio. "Base command. Priority communication for General Caldwell. We need secure uplink immediately." Within minutes, they were back in the operations center with the suspects secured and the evidence laid out on examination tables. General Caldwell arrived with a federal liaison officer and an expression that suggested she'd been expecting bad news. "Report," she said simply. The specialist gestured to the equipment array. "Coordinated intelligence operation using compromised humanitarian credentials. They've been systematically extracting operational data from multiple military installations while maintaining cover as legitimate relief coordinators." Caldwell studied the documents Webb had found. "How long?" "Based on the equipment wear patterns and data storage capacity, at least 6 months. Possibly longer. Scope of compromise? Potentially every base that coordinates with international relief coordination. We're looking at operational security breaches across the entire Northern Command structure." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of electronic equipment and the sound of snow against the windows. Webb could see the calculation running behind Caldwell's eyes. How many operations might have been compromised? How many personnel could be at risk? How many ongoing missions would need to be scrubbed and redesigned? "Federal custody for the prisoners," Caldwell said finally. "Full intelligence debrief, national security priority. All evidence transfers to counterintelligence immediately." She turned to the specialist. "I need damage assessment within 24 hours. Every base, every operation, every piece of information that could have been compromised. And I need to know who's behind this." "Understood, General." As the federal transport arrived and the prisoners were transferred, Webb found himself standing beside the specialist in the empty operations center. The crisis was contained, but the implications were still unfolding. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we find out how deep this goes," she replied, already connecting her equipment to the base's main communication system. "And we make sure it never happens again." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but the electronic silence that had masked the intrusion was finally broken. For the first time in days, Whitmore Air Base was truly secure. But Webb suspected that security had come at a price none of them were ready to calculate. The secure briefing room had been cleared of all personnel except for those with the highest clearance levels. General Caldwell sat at the head of the polished table, her expression grim as classified documents were spread before her, like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture none of them wanted to see. Webb stood along the wall, with Lieutenant Morrison and Technical Analyst Foster, all of them promoted to observers in a game whose stakes they were only beginning to understand. At the center of it all, the woman specialist who had finally introduced herself as Dr. Rachel Matthews. Defense Intelligence Agency methodically presented findings that transformed their local security breach into a national crisis. The operation spans 18 months, Dr. Matthews said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was reporting. systematic infiltration of humanitarian logistics networks across 7 command regions. They didn't just steal information. They built an intelligence collection system that gave them real-time awareness of military operations throughout the continental United States. Commander Harrison, who had remained silent through most of the briefing, finally spoke. "How did we miss something this extensive?" "Because they were patient," Matthews replied. Instead of dramatic data theft that would trigger security reviews, they collected small amounts of information from dozens of sources. Personnel schedules from one base, cargo manifests from another, communication protocols from a third. Individual pieces that seemed harmless but created a complete operational picture when combined. She activated a wall display showing a map of the United States dotted with red markers. Each marker represented a military installation that had been compromised through the Humanitarian Coordination Network. Whitmore was actually one of the last targets, she continued. By the time they reached you, they already had enough information to predict military responses to potential threats, identify vulnerable facilities, and potentially disrupt operations on a massive scale. Caldwell leaned forward. "Who's running this?" "Still analyzing, but the sophistication suggests state-level resources. The equipment we recovered includes components manufactured in at least 4 different countries, assembled using techniques that require specialized knowledge and operated by personnel with advanced training in military communication protocols." Webb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. They knew exactly how our systems worked. "More than that," Matthews said, "they knew how we think." The operation was designed around American military psychology, our tendency to trust established relationships, our reliance on procedural verification, our assumption that humanitarian organizations represent friendly actors. Foster, who had been quietly reviewing technical specifications, looked up from her tablet. "Dr. Matthews, the signal analysis shows they were extracting data in real time. That means they weren't just collecting intelligence. They were actively monitoring ongoing operations." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. If hostile intelligence had real-time awareness of military activities, they could potentially interfere with operations, target personnel, or coordinate attacks based on inside knowledge of defensive capabilities. "Current threat level?" Caldwell asked. "Contained but not eliminated," Matthews replied. "We've shut down their collection network and identified most of their access points, but we have to assume they've already extracted significant operational intelligence. Anything planned using standard protocols should be considered potentially compromised." Harrison rubbed his temples. "Are we talking about scrubbing ongoing operations?" "We're talking about scrubbing everything and starting over with the assumption that hostile intelligence knows our playbook," Caldwell said flatly. "New protocols, new procedures, new verification systems. It's going to take months to rebuild operational security." Webb understood now why a 3-star general had deployed personally to handle what seemed like a routine security breach. This wasn't just about Whitmore or even the Northern Command. This was about the fundamental assumption that American military communications were secure from sophisticated foreign surveillance. "What about the prisoners?" Morrison asked. "Federal custody, national security investigation," Caldwell replied. "But realistically, they're probably operational personnel with limited knowledge of the overall program. The people running this operation wouldn't risk exposing senior assets for field work." Matthews was packing her equipment with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown throughout the crisis. "My part is finished here. Federal counterintelligence will handle the broader investigation, and new security protocols will be implemented across all affected installations." "What about us?" Webb asked. "What happens to the people who uncovered this?" Caldwell looked at him with something that might have been approval. You get to help rebuild the system you helped save. New assignment, elevated clearance, and the satisfaction of knowing you prevented what could have been a catastrophic intelligence failure. She handed Webb a sealed envelope. Joint Task Force assignment. You'll be working with specialists like Dr. Matthews to develop new security protocols and train personnel to recognize sophisticated intrusion attempts. Webb took the envelope, understanding that his quiet career in logistics had just taken a dramatic turn toward the classified world of electronic warfare and counterintelligence. And the base? Harrison asked. Complete security overhaul, Caldwell said. New systems, new procedures, new training for all personnel. Whitmore is going to become a model for the kind of security we need to prevent this from happening again. As the briefing ended and personnel began filing out, Webb found himself standing beside Dr. Matthews as she finished securing her equipment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked at him with the same calm attention he'd noticed when she first arrived. "How did you know? When you first showed up, you already understood what was happening." "How?" Matthews was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Because I built some of the systems they were using against you. Years ago, when I worked on defensive intelligence protocols, we had to understand how hostile actors might try to compromise our networks. What we discovered here wasn't theoretical. It was a practical application of techniques we knew were possible, but hoped nobody would actually implement. So, you were prepared for this?" "I was prepared for the possibility," she said, "but I hoped I'd never see it in practice." Webb watched her walk away, understanding that the quiet woman who had appeared at their gate without credentials carried knowledge that existed in the shadow spaces between official policy and practical necessity. The kind of knowledge that could protect national security or threaten it, depending on who possessed it and how they chose to use it. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. The crisis was over, but Webb suspected his real education was just beginning. The world was more dangerous than he'd realized, but it was also more carefully protected than he'd imagined. People like Dr. Matthews moved through that shadow space, carrying burdens he was only beginning to understand. 3 months after the arrests at Whitmore Air Base, Webb stood in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., watching as the final pieces of a massive counterintelligence operation fell into place. The courtroom was mostly empty cases involving national security, rarely attracted public attention, but the weight of what was happening could be felt in every gesture and whispered. Conference between attorneys. Dr. Rachel Matthews sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, no longer the mysterious civilian who had appeared at their gate but now clearly identified as a senior analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency. She wore a conservative suit and carried herself with the same quiet confidence Webb remembered. But there was something different in her expression: satisfaction, mixed with professional relief. The 2 operatives they'd captured at Whitmore sat at the defense table with their attorneys, looking like ordinary citizens caught up in circumstances beyond their control. But Webb knew better now. In the months since their arrest, federal investigators had unraveled an intelligence network that stretched across multiple continents and involved dozens of operatives working under deep cover. The defendants, the prosecutor was saying, participated in what can only be described as one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations ever directed against United States military installations. Using compromised humanitarian credentials, they systematically extracted operational intelligence from 17 military bases over a period of 18 months. Webb looked around the courtroom, noting the presence of several officials he recognized from classified briefings. General Caldwell sat 2 rows behind him, her uniform displaying ribbons that represented decades of service defending against exactly this kind of threat. The evidence presentation had taken most of the morning. communications equipment, encrypted data files, financial records showing payments from accounts traced to foreign intelligence services. The kind of comprehensive case that resulted from months of careful investigation by people who understood the stakes involved. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, the scope of their operation posed a direct threat to ongoing military missions and the safety of American personnel worldwide. Only the vigilance of base security personnel and the rapid, responsive counterintelligence specialists prevented what could have been catastrophic breach of national security. Webb thought about the night they'd surrounded the van. How routine it had seemed at the time. Just another security issue to be handled according to protocol. He hadn't understood then that they were shutting down an operation that threatened military personnel from Alaska to Afghanistan. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who clearly understood the gravity of the charges, called for a brief recess before sentencing. Webb stepped into the hallway and found himself standing beside Dr. Matthews. "How are you adjusting to your new assignment?" she asked. Webb's transfer to the Joint Counterintelligence Task Force had been challenging but rewarding. Learning to think like the people who threatened security rather than just following established procedures. Understanding that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who looked like friends. "Still learning," he admitted. "But I understand now why you showed up the way you did. Sometimes the system can't protect itself using its own rules." Matthews nodded. "The hardest part of security work is accepting that the people trying to hurt you are often smarter, better funded, and more patient than the people trying to protect you. You have to be willing to think outside normal procedures." When court reconvened, the sentences were significant. 15 years for espionage, additional time for conspiracy charges, and immediate deportation upon completion of their prison terms. The kind of punishment that sent a message to other intelligence services about the consequences of targeting American military installations. But Webb knew the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the changes that had already been implemented across the military. New security protocols, enhanced training for personnel, and improved coordination between bases and intelligence agencies. The kind of systematic improvements that would make future operations like this much more difficult to execute. After the sentencing, General Caldwell approached Webb in the courthouse lobby. "How does it feel to see justice served?" she asked. Webb considered the question. "Satisfying, ma'am, but also sobering. If Dr. Matthews hadn't shown up when she did." "But she did," Caldwell said. "That's what good intelligence work looks like, anticipating threats before they become crises and having the right people in the right places when they're needed." "Is this kind of thing common?" Caldwell was quiet for a moment, watching other personnel file out of the courtroom. "More common than we'd like, less common than our enemies would prefer. The important thing is that we're learning to recognize it and respond appropriately." As they walked toward the exits, Webb saw Dr. Matthews speaking quietly with the prosecutor, probably discussing classified details that wouldn't appear in any public record. The shadow world of intelligence and counterintelligence, where victories were measured not in headlines, but in threats that never materialized. "General," Webb said, "what happens to people like Dr. Matthews? Where do they go next?" Caldwell almost smiled. "Wherever they're needed. People with her skills don't retire. They just move to the next crisis that requires their particular expertise." Outside the courthouse, Washington, D.C. buzzed with the ordinary activity of government. Business. Tourists took pictures, legislators hurried between meetings, and life continued with the comfortable assumption that someone, somewhere, was watching for the threats that ordinary citizens never had to think about. Webb understood now that he was part of that protective network, one of the people who stood between normal life and the sophisticated threats that targeted American security. It was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but was proud to accept. As he walked toward his hotel, Webb's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Next assignment begins Monday. Report to Building 27, Room 15B. Bring everything you learned at Whitmore. He didn't recognize the number, but he didn't need to. In the world of counterintelligence, some communications didn't require signatures. The message was clear. His real education was continuing, and the next crisis was probably already developing somewhere beyond the horizon of public awareness. Webb deleted the message and continued walking, understanding that justice wasn't just about punishing those who threatened security. It was about building systems that could recognize and respond to threats before they succeeded. The game continued, but now he was playing it with better rules and a deeper understanding of what was at stake. 6 months later, Webb stood in the briefing room at the new Joint Security Training Center, watching a group of young officers struggle with a simulation that would have seemed impossible before the Whitmore incident. The exercise was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. Identify a security breach, hidden within normal base operations, using only subtle indicators and indirect evidence. Most of them were failing. The key, Webb said, pausing the simulation, is understanding that sophisticated threats don't announce themselves. They blend in. They use your own procedures against you. They make you trust systems that have been compromised without your knowledge. Lieutenant Sarah Chunno, relation to any previous cases, raised her hand. But sir, how do you investigate without credentials? The simulation shows an unidentified civilian. The protocol requires protocol. Webb interrupted gently, is designed for normal situations. When you're dealing with people who understand your protocols better than you do, following standard procedures can actually make you more vulnerable. He activated a video display showing security footage from Whitmore Dr. Matthews walking through the gate, being detained, sitting quietly in the holding room while evidence of the breach accumulated. Around the base, the students watched with intense focus, understanding they were seeing real events that had shaped new security policies across the entire military. Dr. Matthews could have identified herself immediately, Webb continued. She had the credentials and authority to take control of the situation from the beginning, but she chose to wait. Why? The students exchanged glances, processing the implications. Finally, Chun spoke up. Because if she'd announced herself as a federal agent, the hostiles would have known they were discovered. They would have destroyed evidence and escaped. Exactly. Sometimes protecting security requires accepting temporary insecurity. Sometimes the best way to help is to let people think you're a threat until you can prove you're a solution. Webb walked to the window overlooking the training compound, where other groups were practicing everything from electronic surveillance detection to diplomatic security protocols. The center had been established specifically to address the kinds of threats they'd discovered at Whitmore. Sophisticated, patient, and designed to exploit the trust and procedures that normally kept military installations secure. The broader lesson, he continued, is that security isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding why those rules exist and knowing when circumstances require you to think beyond them. His phone buzzed with a priority message. Situation developing at Peterson. AFB. Unidentified civilian with electronics equipment detained at main gate. Request immediate consultation. Webb read the message twice, feeling the familiar tingle of recognition. Unidentified civilian with electronics equipment. Just like Whitmore. Just like the pattern Dr. Matthews had taught him to recognize. Class dismissed, he said. Study the Whitmore case files and be prepared to discuss decision-making under uncertainty when we reconvene. As the students filed out, Webb was already making calls. First to General Caldwell, then to the Federal Task Force Coordinator, finally to a number that connected him directly to Dr. Matthews, wherever she happened to be operating. "It's happening again," he said when she answered. Peterson Air Force Base, she replied without hesitation. I'm already en route. How did you? Because this is what we do now. We watch for the patterns, we respond to the indicators, and we stop threats before they become crises. Webb understood. In the months since Whitmore, a new kind of security network had evolved. Personnel trained to recognize sophisticated threats, rapid response protocols for unusual situations, and most importantly, the institutional knowledge that sometimes the most important warnings came from people who couldn't immediately prove they belonged. 2 hours later, Webb was on a military transport aircraft flying toward Colorado. Beside him sat Dr. Matthews, no longer mysterious but still carrying the quiet confidence that came from expertise earned through experience. Different base, same pattern? He asked. Probably. The Whitmore operation was too successful for hostile intelligence to abandon the approach entirely. They'll modify their techniques, change their equipment, but the basic strategy of using trusted access to mask intrusion attempts is too effective to discard. And we're ready for it now? Matthews looked out the aircraft window at the landscape. Passing below military installations, communication towers, and infrastructure that represented the defensive backbone of American security. We're better prepared, she said. But the people we're dealing with are smart, well-funded, and highly motivated. They learn from their failures, just like we learn from ours. The challenge is staying ahead of their adaptations while maintaining the openness and trust that makes democratic institutions function. As they approached Peterson, Webb could see the base laid out below them like a detailed map. Runways, hangars, administrative buildings, and perimeter fences that marked the boundary between secure and unsecure space. Somewhere down there, another potential crisis was developing, and another test of their new security protocols was about to begin. Ready? Matthews asked as the aircraft began its final approach. Webb nodded, understanding that this was what his career had become. Not the routine logistics work he'd started with, but the more complex challenge of protecting security in a world where threats came disguised as ordinary problems and solutions sometimes looked like new dangers. The aircraft touched down with military precision, and they were on the ground and moving toward the security building within minutes. The pattern was familiar, now concerned base personnel, detained civilian, and the subtle electronic signatures. That indicated something more sophisticated than it appeared. But this time, they were ready. They understood the stakes, recognized the indicators, and had the authority to act decisively. The shadow war between security and intrusion continued, but the balance had shifted toward those who protected rather than those who threatened. As they walked toward the detention facility, Webb realized that this was what victory looked like in the modern world. Not dramatic confrontations or decisive battles, but the quiet competence of people who understood how to recognize and respond to sophisticated threats before they could succeed. Dr. Matthews was already analyzing her equipment readings, and Webb was already thinking through the protocols they'd developed for exactly this situation. The next chapter of the story was beginning, but they were no longer reacting to surprises. They were ready. Behind them, the aircraft prepared for immediate departure if needed, and across the country, other specialists were monitoring communication networks for signs of coordinated activity. The system they'd built after Whitmore was working, protecting security through knowledge rather than just procedures. And somewhere in the detention facility ahead, another piece of the ongoing puzzle was waiting to be discovered and resolved by people who had learned to see threats hiding in plain sight. The game continued, but they were no longer playing defense. They were winning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.